Okay, well, last week was a week where we talked mostly about deep background, going back all the way to the time of scriptures, where at least I tried to illustrate what I've come to believe, that much of the prejudice that we saw during the Holocaust and even up till today had its roots in some of the early Christian Gospels. They were unfortunately and tragically misinterpreted. And I'm not sure I emphasized enough how the intention of the writers and the intention of the writers of the gospel and the intention of the guy who invented the first blood libel, Thomas of Monmouth, was not necessarily to put Jews down, but it was, in the case of the Gospels, to politically position the believers in Jesus so the Romans would like them better. And then the Thomas of Monmouth wanted to canonize poor William of Norwich in order to get a patron saint of Norwich. And the vehicle he used for that was a supposedly ritual murder, religious ritual murder by Jews. He made it all up. But he didn't have any particular animus toward Jews. He just wanted to get this kid canonized, which he didn't succeed in doing, by the way. But down through the centuries, what happened what was written in the Gospels, and then later on by the church fathers like Chrysostom, and then the stories of the blood libels, they just became, they were believed, and they sort of took on a life of their own. They were tragically misinterpreted. And down through 2 millennia, the result of that was the Holocaust. There's a lot of other factors that go into it, but the point is that something that was intended for one purpose was utterly perverted and ultimately used for other more tragic, evil purposes. So that's something that has surprised me in reading and thinking about the Holocaust. So also the idea of Jews as a race rather than as adherents to a religion didn't begin until the mid-1800s with the way to victory of Germanicism over Judaism that was printed 12 times, had 12 editions by 1879, focusing on the racial characteristics of Jews. Point being there, to me, and something that I was rather surprised, is that Mein Kampf by Hitler was not exactly an original work. He was parroting a lot of stuff that he had learned and absorbed over the years. He didn't invent it at least I thought I did. I thought he did from my limited study of history in high school.
So was Hitler a religious person?
I wouldn't say that he was. He was Catholic. I think he might have actually wanted to go into the priesthood at one time, but he went off into other directions.
Yeah.
He also wanted to be an artist. It's too bad that he didn't get into the Vienna Academy of Art. There are so many inflection points where if it had happened a different way, would the Holocaust have taken place, or would World War II have taken place? We don't know, and it's an interesting exercise to speculate, I think. There's one other way. Okay, well, so here is what we'll talk about. A little bit of a recap of last week, and then this will be sort of the day when we talk about the macro history, the big movements, the way the Nazis organized and carried out the Holocaust. Talk about some of the people who were the chief movers of it, and then a little bit on the concentration camps themselves, because they were, everybody knows what a concentration camp is, and we all think of Auschwitz as the first one. But there wasn't until very recently a definitive study of all the concentration camps done, and it's on the book list that I gave you, KL, Konzentrationslager, I think is the way that the Germans would say it. But it's a complete history of the camps themselves. And it's very thick, but it's worth getting through if you're interested in that subject. Okay, so there were 11 million people killed in the Holocaust, 2/3 of all the Jews living in Europe, and 3/4 of the Jews who were killed were killed in a span of 20 months, June 1941 to February 1943. That was largely in something the Germans called Operation Reinhard, in memory of their dear departed SS leader Reinhard Heydrich, who was murdered. They were able to bump him off in the former Czechoslovakia, and in his memory they had Operation Reinhard and ramped up the slaughtering considerably. One of the things that I've been impressed about in thinking about the Holocaust is how gradual it was, how it was, maybe it doesn't seem like it was inevitable, but there's first one thing happened, and then another thing happened, and then another thing happened. Take away a couple of rights from the Jews here, and then the next month do something else, do something else, do something else. I'll be reciting some of that chapter and verse here, but the point that the point is that it sort of took on a life of its own. Granted, Hitler was an evil, charismatic leader, but he was sort of steering the snowball as it was going downhill, I think. It's sometimes seems like it was almost inevitable, looking at the background and looking at how things built, particularly in the terrible year of 1933. And we talked about 1933 being a year where the Reich Concordat with the Vatican took place. It was also the year when the German industrialists had a final chance to stand up to Hitler and not fire their Jews, and they decided not to do it. And then a little bit later on, the 1936 Olympics, had they been boycotted, maybe Germany would have gotten a second look by the nations of the world before it was too late. Again, we don't know. I do want to respond to one. Yes.
The benevolent dictator, Józef Pilsudski, had approached England and France to try and stop the rearming, remilitarizing Germany in 1935. Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with Pilsudski for 10 years, because France and England didn't want to go into any other further conflicts, of military conflicts.
And treaties don't mean anything to Hitler anyway.
Well, no, correct.
Right.
This is in 1939.
And buying time. I was talking about the hierarchy of the Catholic Church last week, and how, in a great sense, they did not do their job. They fell down, while many individual Catholics and lower-ranking clergy, particularly nuns, were heroic during the Holocaust. The big guys utterly failed. And as an aside, the nuns especially, somewhere in one of the books I read was that approximately half of the convents in Europe sheltered Jews. They just hid them of their own accord. The women really stepped up. But someone asked about, how about, did Protestant Christians voice anything differently? Did they say anything differently? I did mention this rally in New York, and there's the infamous Father Coughlin, the radio priest, who was the head of the Christian Front. That rally was in February 1939, and I did mention the editors of Equality magazine taking Cardinal Spellman to task, reminding him that 90% of the Christian Front's population is Catholics, and what are you Catholics doing? Are you endorsing Hitler or not? They put him on the spot. But in November of -- the Brooklyn Church and Mission Federation, this is in New York once again. New York was much more resistant than Boston, I'm sorry to say. But the Brooklyn Church and Mission Federation, representing every Protestant denomination in that borough, so all of the different Protestant sects. I don't know that much about Protestantism, but I think it's safe to say that they are more decentralized. They don't speak with the same unified voice that the Catholics do. They can get together on occasion, and they certainly did here. But they warned all Protestants against the Front, calling it unchristian. So they were, directly taking on their Catholic brethren who had been led astray. So they did speak out with one voice at that time, and that was admirable. Somebody asked if they did, and I vaguely recalled it, but I didn't know the details of it. So the Protestants did step up. American Protestants did step up at that time. So that was good of them. Okay, so now we'll move to the beginning of the death camps and the final solution. In the 1920s were a pretty turbulent time, post-war. A lot of people were vying for power throughout Europe, communists, Nazis, and so forth. There was an awful lot of lawlessness and terror. Hitler was coming to power. He had his beer hall putsch in Munich in 23, which failed, but that was he got a lot of followers to be following him even then. So he was building up even through the 1920s, and even back then the Nazis, when they would gang up and get together, one of their major tactics was just to throw people who opposed them in prison, any kind of prison they could find, warehouses, factories, real jails, or jails they would manufacture. They just, to get them out of circulation, they would incarcerate them without any kind of trials or anything. Then they had brute force. The Weimar government wasn't particularly effective, and that was sort of the beginning. It's maybe the seed of the concentration camps. They'd incarcerate anybody who resisted them. In 1926, Hitler started talking about the stab in the back, how our troops were betrayed by the people at home, and it was the communists and the Jews who infiltrated the government who were particularly responsible. We would have won the war. And so he was already setting up his enemies for the future then with the stab in the back. In 1933, alone in Berlin, there were 50 places of incarceration. Just in Berlin, incarceration and tortures. There were warehouses, garages. The largest of them was Columbia House near Tempelhof Airport. 500 people died in custody there, and they were opponents of the regime, a lot of communists, a few Jews. The biggest religious group that was imprisoned in these early concentration camps and prisons weren't the Jews, it was the Jehovah's Witnesses. And the witnesses they don't take part in civic ceremonies, holidays, and that sort of thing. Well, the Nazis didn't like that because they wouldn't salute, they wouldn't kowtow to them. And later on, they de-emphasized it because they realized that the witnesses weren't going to oppose them either, and they moved on to bigger and worse things. Heinrich Himmler was the guy who opened the Dachau, the first camp. That is it's the only camp that was in operation throughout the entire Holocaust, throughout the war. It was operating right until the end of the war.
It did become a death camp, right?
Yes, it did. Yeah, they installed gas chambers and did some other stuff there later on. And that's characteristic of camps. The physical facilities themselves went through some iterations and some building up, depending on who was incarcerated there and whether they wanted to make it a work camp, a death camp, or in some cases both. But Himmler announced that Himmler was a former chicken farmer who was the chief of police of Munich. And remember, Munich was where Hitler really got his start. He's from Austria. He spent a lot of several years in Vienna, absorbing the anti-Semitism of the mayor there, whose name escapes me. But he was another early Jew-hating public figure whose gospel Hitler undoubtedly absorbed himself. But he did come to Munich, and that's where his beer hall putsch was. Now, the killing started in 1933, and here's another example of how something almost was arrested, but then it wasn't. There was a school teacher named Sebastian Nevsker. He was beaten to death while he was imprisoned there at Dachau, and they claimed he had committed suicide. The SS administrators, okay. The Munich public prosecutor, he was still in power at the time, he brought charges against them, and he was immediately overruled by Hitler, though. But at least there was an attempt by civil government, even that late, to make the rule of law still work. But it didn't happen. Hitler saw what was happening, and he just issues an edict saying that Dachau and other concentration camps weren't subject to German law as it applied to German citizens. SS administrators are totally in charge of the camps, and they can do as they see fit. So this was the Führer saying they can operate outside the law. So here, I think it's a pretty important development, because then if you place something outside the law, well, ordinary citizens can't seek redress, or they don't have anywhere to go. So this photo here is from 1933, and this was another year where this, what they call this, this is for the word for self. I'm not sure what that whole word is. German is great where they string together 5 or 6 different words to make one, but it's something about showing your loyalty. But within the space of a year, everybody in Germany was doing the Hitler salute. Everybody. And if you didn't, you would get beaten up. There were one of the books on the list in the Garden of the Beast talks about Ambassador Dodd, who was sent to Germany at that time. He lasted just a couple of years, and he had occasion many times to complain to senior authorities there, and occasionally to Hitler himself, about people who were American citizens who might be watching a parade of stormtroopers, and they didn't give the Hitler salute when the parade goes by. Toughs from the SA, the brown shirts, would get out of the parade, beat the hell out of the person there, leave them bleeding on the street, and then get back into the parade. They were foreign citizens, but if they didn't do the Hitler salute too, they could get beaten up. And very little happened. So occasionally they would tone it down a little bit, but it always came back. So, citizens of other countries. Now, in 1933, here is this says 1922, it's actually 1933. This is a prisoner who was beaten to death in Dachau. His name is Louis Schloss, and there were legal proceedings about it, and the commander ended up getting fired, and he was replaced by a guy named Theodor Eicke, who was one of the major actors who was really very responsible for the discipline, the organization, and the discipline of the SS in the camps. He was the worst guy to have there, or if you were a Nazi, he was the best guy to have there, put in charge at the time. But he was, this man was, it's remarkable that a photograph of him ever survived when you think about it. But this was, again, in that terrible year of 1933, and nothing ever happened to anybody who did it.
Glacial tongue is towing the line.
Excuse me, I'm sorry?
Glacial,
That
the
word.
previous slide.
Yeah,
The glacial tune means towing the line.
towing the line, okay. Thank you. That's and you can see that even today sometimes, can you, with some of the polarizations we have in society. If you're not with me, you're against me. So we don't beat up people necessarily, but anyway. Moving on. Okay, so the more evolutionary developments, the Gestapo, Geheime Staatspolizei, is the official state police. They were not all that involved in the administration of the camps. They ended up being run by Hermann Goering, who was a political rival of Heinrich Himmler. He ended up losing out and went off and did other things. He became the commander of the Luftwaffe, and he became an art collector with stolen art and enriched himself that way. Ernst Röhm was a guy who was a buddy of Hitler's right from the early days. He was the head of the SA, the Sturmabteilung, which were the brown shirts. There was the SA and the SS. The SA was the first iteration of it, and they did Hitler's dirty work before he came to power and in the early years of his coming to power. They would be enforcers, and if anybody disagreed with the Nazis or resisted them in any way, they would get beaten up by the SA. Ernst Röhm was a guy who was loyal to Hitler even up until the time they assassinated him. In the night of the Long Knives in 1935, he was killed, and then his power devolved to Heinrich Himmler. Himmler and the SS originally reported to this guy. The SS was originally an elite bodyguard of people who would go around and protect SA leaders of rallies. They would stand around the SA guy and protect him, and then it gradually shifted, so the SS got bigger and bigger and bigger. And when they were able to get rid of Ernst Röhm in the Night of the Long Knives, Himmler was put in charge, and the SS quickly grew to 50,000 people in 1935. Interestingly enough, the getting rid of Ernst Röhm at that time was seen as a reforming, civilizing movement on the part of Adolf Hitler, because he had become chancellor. He was then in charge of the government after 1933. He no longer needed people outside the government to beat up in and around civil society and show how ineffective the government was. In fact, he was the government, so, and people were getting a little bit tired of Röhm and the brown shirts. Anyway, also, Röhm was a blatant and abusive homosexual. He was a pervert. His reputation was known, and that getting rid of him was a cleaned up society, and people were happy about that. He ended up being assassinated by Theodor Eicke, who was the guy who had been put in charge of Dachau. Röhm was imprisoned in Dachau, and then Eicke went in and shot him. But even at the time he was shot, he was loyal to his Führer. He was also a potential rival to the Führer. He wanted more control of the army, and he had all these troops reporting to him, so he had to be bumped off for that reason too. So anyway, that was the Night of the Long Knives. Concentration camps were not all that big, even by 1935. You can see the populations there. Dachau, a little bit over 1,000 or 1,500. These were all in and around the Berlin area of Germany. And eventually, there were 27 main camps, concentration camps. There were killing camps, work camps, and combinations, if you will. But there were, I was very surprised to learn that there were over 1,100 of the so-called satellite camps, where there would be, the satellites would be feeders to a main camp. I have a diagram we'll look at in a moment. But they would be the sites of, there may be a factory or two there, or a quarry, or roads being built, or something like that. And prisoners they often would go to the main camp, get shipped out to the satellite camp, get worked very hard, come back to the main camp to die. If you saw I'm sure many people here saw Schindler's List. That camp was Plaszow. I'm not sure that's the way to pronounce it, but that was a subcamp of Auschwitz. That was not a main camp. There were, and another thing about when the word about these concentration camps got around, one of the things the Fuhrer was able to do was say, hey, everybody does this. The British did it in the Boer War, and they had pictures of concentration camps where the Brits had imprisoned Boers during the African War. So, I mean, they got you there. And then another point about the overall system of the death camps. Fewer than 50% of the people who went into the camps in Germany survived. And the Russian Gulag, as bad as that was, around 90% of the people did not die there. They worked very hard, obviously, but they didn't die. They didn't get killed. Here is a diagram of satellite camps. Here's Buchenwald. And all of these sites here are satellite camps for Buchenwald. So again, I thought that the camps were fairly major facilities, and they would dot the landscape, and a lot of them were in Poland or current-day Belarus or something like that. But this is all over Germany, and these are all seems to me, all in residential neighborhoods. At least some of them are. How people could not know what was happening to Jews, it does stretch the imagination when you see how extensive these facilities were. And they would open and close depending on local needs, but there were a total of 1,100 of them operating during the war. Here is a picture of one. This is the Dora satellite camp. That is that's one of the sub-camps of Buchenwald. That is where the Nazis moved the making of the V-2 rockets after the Allies found out where they were doing it at, I guess, Peenemünde over by the coast. They moved the facilities inland, and down underneath there, they produced a couple of thousand V-2 rockets. This camp, there weren't that many Jewish prisoners there. Some of them were Jews in one wave, but a lot of it was a lot of the work was done by prisoners of war. But there's one. Okay. So, going back a little bit to the historical timeline now, some of the events I'll enumerate here from the year of 1933, I think illustrate the point on how first is one step, then another, then another, then another. So Hitler gets to be appointed German Chancellor in 1933. Jewish population, a little bit over 500,000, is about 1% of the population of the country. That's a very small minority. All right, there were 40,000 SA men were sworn in at that time as auxiliary police, and they burned the Reichstag building. They opened up Dachau, and then Buchenwald came out pretty soon after that. And Ravensbrück for women opened up. 1933 was a horrible, horrible year. In March, they passed the Enabling Act giving Hitler dictatorial powers, and that was legal, but it was also a sham because Hermann Goering, who was the president of the Reichstag at that time, threw in jail 81 communists and 26 social democrats, so they couldn't vote on the Enabling Act, and everybody else was intimidated, and they ended up voting, and it was legal, but not really. But then in April '33, there was a boycott of Jewish businesses. Nazis decided, well, let's boycott the businesses. They issued a decree saying anybody descended from a non-Aryan, that's how they defined the Jews. If you're descended from a non-Aryan, especially Jewish grandparents or grandparents, and one grandparent or grandparent means you're one Jewish grandparent means you're non-Aryan, so you're on the outs. If one of their 4 grandparents was of the Jewish faith. The Gestapo in April 26th of '33. In May, they had the burning of the books, and then they passed a law to strip Jewish immigrants from Poland of German citizenship. Laws on forced sterilization. They established the Reich Chamber of Culture. In September, that was the Chamber of Culture. And then comes another law prohibiting Jews from owning land. They're prohibited from being newspaper editors. They passed a law about habitual criminals and homeless to allow them to sweep more people into prison. But it's just one step after another, a little bit more deprivation of rights, something else taken away, a little bit less ability to fight back this month than you had last month, and it went on and on. And the SS came right to the fore. And it was a great career for young men and for young women. They had all sorts of esprit. These are sentries at Buchenwald. They're working out. They're showing how physically adept they are. It was a career that would make you a lot of money and get you a lot of prestige working for the SS. You'd go to the camps and torture and kill people. Then you go home at night to your family, and I don't know. And don't forget the ladies. These are guards from the Majdanek prison camp at a Lublin dance hall. This is in 1944, but they all look like the girl next door, don't they? Women played a big part too in the Holocaust and in the bad doings of the Nazis. Everybody was in on it. Okay, moving on through 1934, when the SA leader Rome was killed, and then actually the army. After that happened, the army was grateful, and they lined up behind Hitler. He was eliminated as a possible rival, but it was obviously important for him to have the army on his side. He didn't initially have any control of the army when he was building up and working mostly through the brutality of the SA thugs, but the army came over to him. Was there a question? Also, the Night of the Long Knives didn't kill just Ernst Röhm and a few other people. There were between 150 and 200 people were slaughtered, and they were that was more than all of it in the preceding year happened in one night. And this is another event that was sort of seminal in that the SS now gets used to mass killings. You know, we've killed a whole bunch of people during one night. Hey, this is what we do. That's the first night that they did it. In 1934, the SS was made independent. Then more laws against Jews, more measures against Jews. They were prohibited from getting qualifications to work as lawyers. And then Hindenburg dies in 1934, the president, who was not all there mentally anyway by the end of his life, but Hitler ended up succeeding him and getting total power. They banned Jews from serving in the military. And then 1936, the Olympics. That was, in many ways, I think the Olympics was sort of a high watermark of prestige of Germany and the international community. They did put on a great show, and they cleaned up Berlin, and it was, as we mentioned last week, the biggest Olympics ever held. And after people went away, well, then the real bad stuff started. But they were on good behavior, and they really did pull it off. They pulled off a great propaganda coup, which was very, very unfortunate. Some other laws, again, building the wall of separation between Jews and the rest of the German world. In June of 1935, they passed a law allowing forced abortions by people who are suspected of having any hereditary disease. That's not really anti-Jewish. It's a little bit more than that. But then in August, Jewish performers and artists had to join what they called the Jewish Cultural Union. And then came the Nuremberg race laws. They were in 1935. They were more depriving of the Jews of the rights of citizenship. The first one, the law for protection of German blood and German honor, which was regarding the Jewish marriage, and then the Reich citizenship law, which designated people as subject. And then they were followed by the law for the protection of the genetic health of the German people, in which people had to get certified as being medically fit in order to be married. And that was, by the way, that was one of the thoughts behind the Jews, the Nazis' persecution of homosexuals. A lot of gays were in the camps. The Nazis didn't go out and try to find them in other nations, but if they were in the Reich, because they were homosexual, they weren't going to reproduce kids, they're not going to produce babies for the Reich, we don't like them. That's really why they were treated poorly, but they weren't treated badly as Jews either. They were put into concentration camps, but there was a hierarchy within the camps, and the Jews were down at the bottom, and others, including the homosexuals, and they were a little bit above anyway. Not that it was great, but the reason they were there was that they couldn't reproduce. They finally did settle on what was a full Jew, what a full Jew was in the Nuremberg race laws. If you had 3 Jewish grandparents, you're a full Jew. You were a Mischlinge of mixed blood if you had fewer than 3, but you were still a Jew. Okay. And then the Death's Head Division, the SS was already organized, but they had, this is when the guys with the black uniforms came in, and their esprit de corps and their savagery in killing under Heinrich Himmler and again, Theodor Eicke, the head of the camp in Munich, at Dachau in Munich, the discipline that he imposed along with Heinrich Himmler really made the Death's Head Division operate the way it was. Concerning propaganda, okay, The Eternal Jew was a propaganda film. There's a poster for it, and this is Julius Streicher, who published Der Stürmer, The Attacker. That's a tabloid that was there from 1923 or so, and it published all the way up through the end of the war. You could pick up a copy of this in newspaper boxes on in every corner, on every street corner of Berlin, other than for the month before the Olympics and during the Olympics. They took them all away, and they brought them right back. But the Stryker was a very unsavory character, and Hitler actually didn't like him or wanted to distance himself from him, at least publicly, but he needed the hatred and the venom that he was so good at spreading through his Der Stürmer. First, the Eternal Jew, the film, it was very popular around Germany in the late 30s and the early 40s. One of its more notorious sequences compares Jews to rats that carry the contagion. They flood the continent. They pollute the bloodlines. They would photograph stereotypical Polish Jews with beards and then shave them and say, see, they actually look normal. Watch out for them. And there was, these were unmasking scenes. The attempt was to show that there was no difference between the Jews who lived in German neighborhoods and, Polish Jews and others from out in Far East. They're all the same. They're all bad. The eternal Jews were to be fought no matter where they were. The film ends with Hitler's speech to the Reichstag on January 30th, 1939, saying, if international Jewish financiers inside and outside Europe should succeed in plunging this nation once more into world war, then the result will not be the victory of Jews, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. So already he's blaming the international financiers for starting the war, which, as we know, he started himself. So that he wasn't quite ready to mandate that they all be killed, but that was a seminal point there. Now with Stryker, his publication first started off as a one that did actually political hit jobs. There was in Nuremberg, he campaigned against a Jewish guy named Julius Fleischmann, who worked for the mayor that Stryker didn't like. He smeared him up and down and he went to trial and ended up being fined 900 marks in court. But it didn't matter. As Stryker said, and I think you'll agree with this, something always sticks. So even if it's an outlandish accusation, if it's made, it sticks. And I think we even see that nowadays in our political life. Pick your poison, whatever side you're on. You know that there are outlandish accusations against people on the other side, and those who are on this side believe it, even though it's untrue. It does stick. And the guy was right, unfortunately. And he also used the blood libel as one of his major themes. This is a cartoon of the blood libel. These are the Jews crucifying the kid. They're draining his blood to make matzah, right there. And here's a Jew milking the World Bank. That guy is a Jew pumping money out of the cow. This was all believed. And around 1938, the rhetoric in this began to change. It wasn't just the Jews are these awful, beastly, terrible people. He took up the line that they've got to die and that all Jews have to be killed. So he started to talk in terms, or publish in terms of the rhetoric of the final solution. We don't know when the order was actually given, even if it was given, but around 1938, that's when this guy started to publish in this very popular tabloid that all Jews had to die. Stryker, by the way, was found guilty of crimes against humanity at Nuremberg. He was sentenced to be hanged. And when they went to his cell, he was reading the Song of Bernadette. And that, as he climbed up the scaffolding, he spat at the hangman, and as he was falling to his death, he said, "Purim Festival 1946." So he was not a nice man, but he was that kind of vermin operating in a campaign like this. You need guys like this if you have horrible, nefarious designs. You need people to carry out your dirty work. And Hitler had one who was very effective in that guy, unfortunately. Okay, a little bit more on the timeline. 1938 was a very bad year. That was the Anschluss of Austria. There was a much greater Jewish population. I believe it was around 20%, 200,000 Jews were there. The Sound of Music isn't an accurate picture of Austria at that time. That's I think if you want to see something that's more realistic, the Helen Mirren movie, The Woman in Gold, is a good one. Has anybody seen that? But the Austrians turned on a dime as soon as they were incorporated back into the Reich. Remember, they had been part of it before, and then it was they were broken off after World War I. But now they're back with the homeland, with the fatherland, and they thought it was great. As soon as the Anschluss happened, they opened up the Mauthausen camp, the Mauthausen concentration camp. The next week, they opened it up. Mauthausen was near a quarry, and it was a place of terribly hard physical labor. Much of the stone that was quarried to build the monuments during the Reich came from there. But the Austrians were enthusiastic participants in the Holocaust. And then actually when the decree came and the Austrians embraced it, they sent about 1,500 prisoners to Dachau. They were sent there in June of 1938. The initial aim then was to just get them to leave the country and by the way, take all their property. One of the early jobs that Adolf Eichmann had when he joined the Nazis, he was assigned to Vienna, and he would just get all the material goods from the Jews that they expelled. And there were a lot of very well-to-do Jewish people there, as you might imagine. And I think it was around then that the Nazis really realized what a bonanza we could have here. The plunder we're going to get, not only from the religious establishments, the gold lampstands and other precious items you would find in a religious establishment, but just everywhere. All furs, money, art. I think it began there, and Eichmann was one of the very first operators there. Mr. Rosenberg, who was another hanger-on with Hitler from the early days, was also a big operator in confiscation of Jewish art and treasures. But Eichmann had quite a hand of it in Vienna in the early days. 1938 also was the time of the Munich Agreement, where they sold Czechoslovakia down the river. Kristallnacht happened right after that, the night of the broken glass. And there were 267 synagogues burned, 7,500 businesses had windows smashed and shops looted, and there were 91 Jews actually killed, and the Jews were fined 1 billion marks because it was their fault. It happened because a Jewish youth in Paris went into a diplomatic office and assassinated a minor functionary because he had heard that his parents in Poland had been deported. They were never heard from again. He just went in and blasted a young man who actually may not have been a great Nazi sympathizer. There appears to be some indication that he didn't really buy Hitler's act, and had this guy stayed alive, he might have been able to be of help down the line, but that didn't happen. So that was the excuse for Kristallnacht, and they were just waiting for some kind of an event like that to happen. Reinhard Heydrich, the second in command of the SS, was the guy who really organized it, and the Hitler Youth and the SA and the SS rather were the perpetrators of it throughout Germany, and that was again, this is another seminal event in that the victims of Kristallnacht were targeted only because they're Jews. They didn't do anything. Just because they're Jews, we have to get them, or let's go get them now. So there was no accusation of crime or disloyalty or anything. It was just because you're Jews, period. So 1938 was, they were showing the world what they were all about. There was the Evian conference, which I mentioned last week in talking about FDR. That was something that he put together to try to get the good nations of the world to help refugees, and nobody would step up to the plate, including America. We did not open our doors, lift quotas for visas or anything like that. So nobody did anything, and it was an utter failure and a propaganda coup, actually, for Hitler. See, nobody cares, and you can't get him to do anything, FDR. Sorry. A minor step that we Americans did take. We were the only country, I think I mentioned, who recalled its ambassador after Kristallnacht. We didn't want to have anything more to do with them on an official level. We recalled the ambassador, brought him home, but nobody else, no other country did at that point. So, terrible. Terrible year of 1938. Was there a question? How are we doing on time?
10 minutes or so.
Okay. All right. Let's, all right, and then, well, I just mentioned the Kristallnacht was the policy shift. They were taken just because they were Jews. A lot of them still did get out, though. They signed over their businesses and their personal wealth, and they were allowed to leave Germany. And there were again, we don't know what in their heart of hearts what Hitler and the leaders really thought would ultimately be done, because there were many plans floated over the course of the early years. They were going to send them to Madagascar. They were going to send them out to the lands of the East and make them slave laborers in the bread baskets of the Ukraine. And maybe if we can just get them to emigrate and take all their money, we might do that too. They didn't appear to know whether they were going to just resort to killing Jews. That decision happened a little bit later. And again, we don't know exactly when it happened, but when it happened, I guess officially, but the moves that were taken in and around the Vance conference, which we'll get into a little later, indicate that it was taken probably around 1940, the step taken around 1940. But war broke out in 1939. Hitler decides to attack Poland, and that signaled, France and England had to come in. And there was a non-aggression pact with Russia, as we know. So, but France and England at least did declare war against Germany. And 1939, it was official. Let's see, where else? A little bit more about the camp populations in 1939. There aren't that many people in these camps yet. What is that for? Maybe 20,000 people. The big action, the big killing was yet to come after 1939. There were the mass arrests around 1939. Again, after Kristallnacht, 30,000 Jews were taken initially and incarcerated and jammed into camps. About 450 of them died, but many of them were subsequently released if they would sign over their property. And now, though, the regime was going public with anti-Jewish propaganda, with anti-Jewish steps. They really couldn't hide their evil intentions anymore. So if anybody was doubtful of reports that were trickling out of Germany during the 30s, they couldn't have been doubtful anymore by 1939 and 1940. Okay. This might be a good time to take a break. Okay? Question?
Buchenwald,
Yeah.
beach, forest.
I know Wald is forest, but okay. My son spent a year when he was in high school, he spent a year in Passau, which is right on the border of Austria and Bavaria. It's called the Dreiflussstadt, Three Rivers City. And it's, I'll mention some of its history in the final day, but he loved it there. It has, among other things, the biggest pipe organ in the world in its cathedral. And it's very picturesque. And Passau was also a subcamp of Mauthausen. They had some bad stuff going on there during the war. Okay, looking at the historical timeline, when war broke out, there was the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Molotov, the foreign minister for the Soviet Union, and Joachim von Ribbentrop, who was the foreign minister for Adolf Hitler, who got his job because he traveled around the country selling wine. That was his background before he became the foreign minister. And I did read somewhere that he and Wallace Simpson had at least one role in the hay, if not more than one, somewhere along the way. That's believable if you watch The Crown. Anybody see The Crown? Anybody like that? When is the next season coming out?
I don't know, I keep checking.
You know, I thought it was going to be in December.
I know, I thought it was sooner than now too. I keep feeling like my husband and I DVR a lot of that stuff so we can watch it at our leisure, and we keep feeling like we've missed it.
Yeah.
That hasn't.
Yeah, you can have Game of Thrones. I'll take The Crown.
Right.
In fact, I'm one of the 1%. I've never seen Game of
I
Thrones.
never need to.
Okay, but here is the way. This line actually has a lot to do with how the Holocaust evolved, and particularly the family in the Holocaust that I'll be talking about in our next section. The lady whose biography I'm helping to write. They were from Vilna, Lithuania. It was actually Vilna, Poland. This is Lithuania in 1940 now. It's bigger, and that's Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. But here is the dividing line. The Germans took this, the Russians took this, and you know, for 2 years until Hitler decided he didn't like that treaty anymore. That was how they divided up the lands of Poland and Western Russia. And many of the camps and ghettos ended up being in here, as we'll see. Okay, in 1940, they chose Auschwitz for a camp site. It was an ideal place for a camp in one sense. It was an ideal place actually for industry and a lot of economic activity to be going on, because it was in an area of Upper Silesia where railroad tracks from Germany and from the west would come in, railroads from Russia, Ukraine, Poland from the east would come in, and they were of different railroad gauges. So if there was going to be any trading done, it had to be done in that area of Silesia. And Auschwitz was an ideal place for big activity. There had been a military camp there. They decided that it was going to be a place for a concentration camp in 1940. A key development in this was Britain's refusal to make peace with Germany. Hitler actually thought the Brits might come over to him and not make war upon him. When Churchill would have none of it and decided to fight, they had to recast a lot of their thinking. And one of the things that they had to think about was, what are we going to do with the Jews? Because there was a plan, the Madagascar plan was proposed still in 1940 to take the Jews and ship them on ships to Madagascar. Well, if the British Navy is operating as your enemy, the Brits have a better Navy than the Germans, well, they were not going to be able to get a lot of ships out onto the ocean and ship prisoners down to Madagascar. So they had to do something with the Jews on the continent. If we're going to solve the Jewish question, as they refer to it, what to do about the Jews, it had to be done on the continent. So shipping them out overseas was no longer an option. They began deporting people into occupied Poland in 1940. Poland as you know, fell very quickly. They did not have a mechanized army. They had a pretty good cavalry, but that was, you know, available maybe to fight not the last war, but the war before that. And they were just overwhelmed by the tanks and the planes and the trucks and so forth of Germany. The Germans rolled over Poland in a matter of weeks, and then they began, right after they would conquer an area, the Einsatz group would follow the troops. The Einsatz group, that is, Einsatz is one task. They had one mission, which was to kill Jews. There were several Einsatzgruppen that operated throughout Germany, and they would come in and slaughter Jews. They were, I guess, a lot of them had to be SS people as well, but SS were running the camps as well. But more deaths were caused by mass shootings than by gassings in the camps. They were, if I don't know the exact numbers, but concentration camps are kind of shorthand for the final solution, when there were really only one tool of it. And relatively late in the war did the killing ramp up in the concentration camps, particularly at Auschwitz. That didn't get going with a lot of killing until late 43 or 1944. There were other things that happened here. The Patria, the disaster in Haifa Harbor. The Patria was a ship that had some Jewish refugees on it, and there were about 2,000 of them, or 2,500. It was docked in the harbor at Haifa, and the Brits would not let them get off. British restrictions of immigration into Palestine, with their infamous white paper that was issued in 1939, I believe it was, the British white paper restricting Jewish emigration to British Mandate Palestine to 20,000 a year. They were, as I mentioned last time, they did issue the Balfour Declaration in 1917, but after that they did their best to frustrate Jewish immigration to their promised land. They were more cognizant of, or more desirous of keeping the local Arabic population happy and to keep the oil flowing. So that was, Jews were a second or third priority to them. And the Patria was in Haifa Harbor, and the Jews who were on the ground there decided that they had to do something about it. The Haganah, which was an organization that my friend Mary's husband belonged to, he wasn't involved in this particular operation, but they decided they were going to bomb the ship, at least to the extent where they would disable it so that it couldn't leave port. They were going to, the plan was to send them to the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. And I guess the Brits must have controlled that, but that's where they were going to send those 2,000 people. The Haganah planted a bomb, and the bomb worked a little too well. It killed a few hundred people, but it did permanently disable the Patria. And finally, the Jews who were on that ship were allowed to disembark, and they went into the Atlit concentration camp there and were eventually freed. But the intent, the bomb worked a little bit too well. I think they were going to try to blow off either the engines or the propellers or something like that, but instead they killed a couple of hundred people there. Birkenau, actually, this was it's also known as Auschwitz too. That was a place where most of the killing took place. The first Auschwitz camp was, there was a lot of labor going on there, but Birkenau was where they did much of the killing. They constructed more gas chambers in 1941, and they did that. They began the more and more killing there. We have some pictures of there in a minute. There were the Struma. I mentioned the voyage of the Struma here. This was another ship that was sunk very tragically. There were 800 Jewish refugees from Romania who were coming to Palestine. The ship broke down near Istanbul in the Bosphorus, and it was torpedoed by a Russian submarine. Most of the people died. It was the largest civilian disaster ever. But then ghettos were quickly established in many of these cities. Once Poland was overrun, it didn't take very long for the Nazis to establish ghettos in Vilna, Kovno, Minsk. Babi Yar in the Ukraine was a place where they had some mass shootings over, I believe it was 2 days. Was it 30,000 people killed? But they were, all the Jews in Kiev were marched out and shot in this ravine at Babi Yar. However, the tide actually began turning right around 1941. The Russians fell back as the Germans invaded them, but they finally did stiffen, and there was a winter counteroffensive, and that had repercussions down the line in terms of some Jews being saved from at least immediate extermination because they had to be put to work as laborers doing things like making shoes and making coats and repairing vehicles, so that the Russian counteroffensive, the stiffening of resistance in 1941, threw a monkey wrench into Hitler's plans, and actually it postponed the Vance conference that was originally scheduled for 1941, and they postponed it a couple of times. We'll get into that a little bit later, but you can't really separate the military campaigns, the ebb and flow of the military campaigns from the fate of the Jews, because depending on how well or how poorly the Germans were doing out in the field, they had to adjust, at least to some extent, their strategy for dealing with Jewish folks. They never did stop killing, and in fact, when the war turned against them more and more in 43 and 44, they seemed to also escalate their campaign to kill the Jews. And so it seems crazy and kind of counterintuitive that they should have devoted more resources to prosecuting the war, but the Jews were a priority. In fact, Hitler was heard to say around 1941, when the Russians did mount a resistance and they realized it was going to be a war, he was heard to remark in one of his meetings or his speeches that the Jews who started this war now will pay for this. So it's the Jews' fault. We're starting to lose, so I have to change my rhetoric, change my propaganda to blame the Jews for what is happening. So any excuse for what you wanted to do anyway. I want to talk a little bit about the T4 program. This was euthanasia. T4 means Tiergartenstrasse 4, which that's the address of the office. The Tiergartenstrasse is a street off the Tiergarten in Berlin. That was the operations office. There were a lot of intellectually trained people there. I find it hard to call them intellectual but I guess they were scientifically trained. But their job was euthanasia, was killing people. It was in 1938. Hitler did allow some of his subordinates in the chancellery to grant parents permission to kill mentally handicapped children. We have to purify the race and not only get rid of Jews, but have anybody who's handicapped or deficient in any way. It's okay to kill them, and that's actually the only time he actually signed an order telling somebody it's okay to kill. It was in 1938. In 1939, they had a decree that hospitals had to report the births of all deformed and handicapped children. And then 1939, the war was getting underway. Soldiers were coming back from the front. They needed hospital space, so get rid of or kill the handicapped or deficient civilian bodies there. Just kill them, because we need room in the hospitals, so bring them back. So this is when mercy deaths, the idea of mercy deaths, began to take hold. And the first steps were to overdose them on medicines, and then they did have gas chambers at the hospitals. It was resisted. It was mostly carbon monoxide gas, by the way. The idea was resisted by the Catholic bishop Clemens von Galen of Munich. He came out very strongly against euthanasia in 1941. It was a horrible thing. They were actually killing people. Again, Munich is in Bavaria, a very heavily Catholic area of Germany. Hitler needed the support of Bavaria and Munich in particular, so he backed off. Clemens von Galen, that was a good thing for him to do. Of course, he didn't talk about killing Jews, just the idea of euthanasia. But that shows, had some other big Catholic bishop or two or three or the Pope taken a very strong public stand against what Hitler was doing, who knows what would have happened. It was effective when von Galen did it in 1941. They ended up moving the operation of the gassing to the camps then. They had learned how to do it, but they dialed it back a little bit in terms of doing it in the civilian population. And before they moved it to the camps, there were about 70,000 people who had been killed in the T4 program, who had been euthanized in Germany. And CO gas, carbon monoxide gas, was hard to come by then. Well, not that hard to come by, but it was expensive and kind of inefficient. But that's when the usefulness of the Zyklon B, the vaporizing pesticide that was invented by the chemist who we mentioned last week, who had found a way to fixate nitrogen in the soil and who did a lot of good for humanity, but he also, his work on pesticides led them to Zyklon B. It was 5 to 7 kilograms per 1,500 victims, 5 marks per kilogram. So the cost per death by Zyklon B was 2 German Pfennig, 2 cents, 1 cent, very cheap. That's German efficiency for you, isn't it? And here are the T4 doctors. These guys were rock stars of the scientific establishment. They had all sorts of respect throughout the scientific community. This is Dr. Meneke here. We have what they specialized in. Let's see. I'm not sure what Meneke specialized in, but these guys had just been to Dachau to carry out some experiments with. I think there might have been a gas pressure chamber at Dachau. I think that's might have been where it was. But Mengele, this is the guy we most often associate with this scientific killing in the camps. There's Joseph Mengele is the guy in the middle there, and there's Rudolf Hess is the commandant of Auschwitz, and then Richard Baer. He's another. I don't know exactly what his job was here, but he was. Mengele was assigned to Auschwitz after he was out on the front, and he got some kind of a commendation, and they sent him there to Auschwitz, and he took over the medical establishment at Auschwitz, and something that he really liked to do was experiment with twins. If a couple of twins came to Auschwitz, you would be subjected to all sorts of horrible tests. They'd drop chemicals in one twin's eyes and drop different chemicals in another one to see if they could change the color of their eyes. Of course, there was no anesthesia in any of the surgery to test pain tolerance. There were people with unusual physiques. One of his favorite objects of experimentation was a family of traveling midgets that had been with a circus. They worked with and on them. And the thing that all of these guys, Mengele at the top, but all of these guys had great cred in the medical community. So this Klauberg mass sterilization, radiation doses for X-rays and radiation were being worked on then. This guy Hurt had a big collection of Jewish skulls at Strasbourg at an institute. It must have been a prestigious thing to go and see. And this is the guy, I believe he worked out of Dachau, air pressure experiments on prisoners to see what, on high altitude flights, what would happen to people. It ended up being torture. When I was doing some research down in Florida, I went down to see Mary a couple of years ago, and I was fortunate to meet with the librarian of the Florida Holocaust Museum in St. Petersburg. If you're ever around there, I would urge you to take it in. It's not as big as the National Holocaust Museum, but it's very well done. On their 2 or 3 floors, they do a remarkable job of telling the story completely and sensitively. But I had a nice chat with this lady who's also a survivor. She was from the western part of Germany and was in a camp that I guess wasn't so bad, and she ended up being liberated by the Americans. So she comparatively lucked out in comparison to the folks out in Poland and out in the East. But she told me, she brought me to a picture that was on the wall in the library. She wouldn't let me take a picture of it. I wish she had. But it was a group of, it was a family gathering. There was at a picnic somewhere. There was the matriarch was seated in the center, and there were adult children, and then younger adult children and grandchildren. There were 4 generations. And that woman was in Auschwitz, and she was the subject of a medical experiment. Another one of the things that they used to like to do was examine the reproductive systems of women. They would lay them down, actually pull out the uterus and the ovaries, and sometimes they'd put them back in, sometimes they wouldn't. But this woman was in surgery, and the doctor was Jewish. Many of the doctors were Jews, and they got dragooned into doing the work, and they'd do it for a while, then they'd get killed, and others would be brought in. But this guy, I find it hard to not get emotional when I tell this story, but this guy was operating on her, and he said, I know I'm going to die, I'm Jewish, and I'm supposed to take both of your ovaries out. I'm going to leave one in. And if you survive, would you name your son after me? And she did. And she had more than one son, and she had a big family. It just tears my heart out. So, okay. But those were the kinds of things that happened. You know, we talk about big numbers, the millions of people who were killed. Everybody has a story like that. Every single person. Okay, this is when they started setting up ghettos. These are the places where most of the ghettos were, and you can see from 41 to 43, the white ones, they were all out in the east. There weren't too many ghettos in France or in what they called the general government, which was the rump of Poland. Okay, the earlier ones were here, but then later on they just kept establishing them. And the ghetto was just a holding pen until they would either kill the people there or ship them to a camp. But that's when the ghettoization started. Okay, a little bit more on Auschwitz. Here, where is it? Right here, Auschwitz and Birkenau. These are killing camps, and these are killing sites. Ponary we'll talk a lot about next time. That's up right next to Vilna. It was the site of a Polish army camp. And another one of the fascinating stories that I was fortunate to hear was from a gentleman whose name is John Loftus. I met him down in Florida as well. When I was down visiting Mary and her family, she said, you know, you're from Boston, there's a guy you should see. He is also from Boston. He's the only non-Jew to be the chairman of the board of the Florida Holocaust Museum. He knows a lot about it. You want to meet him? So, great, love to. Turns out he's a BC classmate of mine. I had never met him because we were, in that era, Boston College was still very largely a commuter school. I lived in Boston. I lived in Winthrop, rather. He lived in Hyde Park. We were in different divisions. I never knew the guy. But he ended up going into the Army. He was an Army lawyer. And one of the final jobs he had was as the prosecutor for German war crimes in Belarus. So he really knew what was going on. And he told me that, among other things, some of the initial plans for the industrial area at Auschwitz before the war happened and before Hitler and Stalin decided they didn't like each other, it may even have gone back to earlier when Lenin was still in power or when Stalin was just getting power. But there were, according to John, there were, they thought that they might be able to jointly exploit slave labor in the mines, that there are some coal mines there and some other mineral resources, that it would have been a joint effort to have as the, a lot of the dirty work of the industrial economies of Russia and Germany would have been done there, and they would have been in on it. And according to this guy, there was a lot of investment early on by, among others, the Chase Manhattan Bank. This is what he says. I have no reason to doubt him. I haven't researched it beyond what he has said to me, but he said, and I'll tell you who sold the stock to people, the Dulleses, I guess, the Allen and John Foster Dulles, as Wall Street lawyers were very big in that before they get into the State Department during and after the war, according to John. And he said the guy who sold Dulles his stock was Prescott Bush. A very big stockholder was Joseph Kennedy. It went on and on and on. It was all these big players in it. It made my head spin. I can't attest to the veracity of that. He was talking to me. I have no reason to doubt him. I don't think he'd make it up. But the point being that we Americans were very much invested in the economy of the Reich. And at least according to him, after the war, the primary function of the Dulleses in the State Department and the CIA were to make sure that Chase Manhattan and the banks got their money back. That was their mission. Okay, it's awful to think that, but it's plausible. So I don't know if that's true. But anyway, it was a fascinating couple of hours I spent with my Boston College classmate. Okay, Jews from Western Europe were the primary victims at Auschwitz. By the way, the camps, the killing camps over here, Kelmo, Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek, Belzec, they were people from the captured lands of Poland and then Ukraine also. They were much of the killing was done there. These camps, there was a very big wave of killing in these killing camps they were a little bit different from the other ones in that they were in somewhat isolated areas. They were purpose-built just for killing. They were not primarily labor camps. 1.5 million people were killed in them. They were mostly Jews from the former Poland, the general government. Let's see, Sobibor, 1942-43 only. Treblinka, 42 to 43, between 700,000 and 900,000. And then they ended up being closed up. The Sobibor, or Treblinka, also had a revolt, which was partially successful. And this is a story that would probably make a good movie. But the revolt was started by some Russian prisoners of war. They were made to work in the shoe shop. I guess they had to cobble boots or something. And they came up with a plan. They made appointments with Nazi officers to come in and have custom work done on their boots. They had them appointments for one at a time, a half an hour apart. And they knew that with German precision, the Germans would show up. So the first guy comes in and he sits down and his shoe was being worked on. And one of the Russian guys comes from behind a curtain, hits him with a shovel or something, kills him, takes his gun, put his body aside, wait till the next guy comes in. And they did it for 4 or 5 times at least, got some guns, they had a breakout, killed a bunch of people. They ended up getting killed themselves, but at least the revolt was partially successful. They did fight back, and good for them. Okay, and then I.G. Farben also set up a camp, a factory near Auschwitz. It was a town or two over, and they used slave labor to make chemicals. And there was that was just out of the range of bombers from Western Europe. Much of the criticism about was leveled at FDR in the post-war years was, you didn't do more. You didn't bomb the camps. You didn't bomb the rail yards on the way to the camps. That's true. There's one of the books that on the list is called FDR and the Jews, which is a fairly recent one. That the conclusion that the author comes there is that we probably should have done it. It probably would not have done a lot of good, but long-range bombers from Italy, from southern Italy, could have gone there and done their bombing and come back. How precise the bombing would have been, you don't know. But those camps were well within range of even short-range flights that Stalin could have mounted if he chose, and of course he never did. Question?
He never did. He wouldn't allow them to land and refuel to go back.
No, he wouldn't. No,
And then the other one, there is a movie called Escape from Sobibor.
oh, yeah, I remember seeing that on TV. Yeah. So anyway, okay, a little bit more detail on the Vance conference, which is something that I thought, having studied history, I thought this was a big meeting of all the top Nazis, and they hashed out all their plans and finally came to a decision on what we're going to do with the Jews. That really wasn't the case at all. It was a staff meeting. 15 people came to it, and it was they didn't accomplish all that much there. In terms of deciding what they were going to do. They sort of already knew they were going to do it. And it was postponed at least once. I believe it was twice, but at least once when the Russian winter counteroffensive mounted in 1941. The Ruskies are finally pushing back, and they figured, well, wait a minute, maybe this isn't going to be so easy after all, so they postponed this meeting. Reinhard Heydrich was the guy who was the chairman of it. And Adolf Eichmann was there too, and he made a presentation. Vance that's a nice looking building. It's on a lake right in the middle of Berlin. Let's see and then remember in 1941 the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and then America comes in. So they also see the war looming much bigger even then. Some of the language that came out of the Vance conference was we'll deport people to the east, okay? But the attendees, 15 attendees, most of them were under 40. Half of them had doctorates. They were very educated guys for the most part. And the first intention seems to be we're going to annihilate the Jews through labor out in the conquered lands of Poland. They'll be worked to death. The camps up until that point had largely, well, there were things like people like gypsies and the homosexuals and others, political prisoners, undesirables, but largely the population of many camps had been Russian prisoners of war, and one of the initial intents was to work them to death, and they were too efficient at that. Many hundreds of thousands of Russian guys died in the camps, mostly from starvation and overwork. The camps had some capacity, so they were available for the Jews. Shortly after that, after the conference, Jews into the KL, into the concentration lager, was issued by Himmler, not by Hitler. But here is the list that there's Reinhard Heydrich, one of the worst people who ever lived. This is the list that was circulated by Adolf Eichmann to all his Nazi buddies at Vance. This is where all the Jews are, 11 million of them. So this we're going to, if we're going to get them or going to move them, here's where they all are in Europe. And again, it took only 90 minutes, and the decision to do away with the Jews probably had already been made. The books that I've read about this said that the real effect of the Vance conference was to establish finally that the job of killing the Jews, running the concentration camps, it was going to be the job of the SS. SS is going to be the one that carries it all out. Heydrich was second in command of it at the time. The deputy to Heinrich Himmler. So it was totally outside the purview of any other part of the German establishment. SS is going to kill the Jews. Later on, by the way, that didn't really end it in terms of the so-called civilian government and the military wing of Germany, because they, particularly after the early victories and the pushback by the Russians, they needed slave labor. They didn't want all these Jews necessarily to be killed. So there was tension between the SS and I know in Vilna and in several other cities, the local civilian commander or the military commander who wanted to keep people alive in order to make them work on behalf of the Reich. So that was, and some people lucked out and did survive. Some of the people we'll meet next time survived greatly because of that. Now here's some of the people who were the chief instigators or chief operators of the final solution. Reinhard Heydrich, I'd mentioned, his father was in opera, his mother was in theater. He's a well-educated individual. He played the violin, but like a couple of others, he was also a loser in that he had been in the Navy. He got the daughter of a very rich industrialist pregnant, and he got busted out of the Navy. And he really had nothing to do, but Himmler took him into the SS, and his first job was digging up dirt on political opponents, and then he was good at it apparently, and he got one big job after another. Adolf Hitler called him the man with the iron heart. He established the Sicherheitsdienst, which was the security service, and he was the second in command of the SS and chaired the Vance conference. He organized the Einsatz group, and they all reported to him, these forces that would follow after the military people, and the Einsatz group would go in and kill the Jews in the conquered lands. They did knock him off in 1942. Some agents in Prague who were trained by the Brits. Another job he was given was as the Governor General or Plenipotentiary of Bohemia, which was the rump of Czechoslovakia after the Munich agreement peeled off some of Czechoslovakia into the Reich. What was left of it, Bohemia and Moravia, he was put in charge of it, and they figured out where he was going to be, and they were able to nail him. He died of his wounds. And as a result of that, of course, they had Operation Reinhard. In his blessed memory, they had a tremendous killing spree, which they called Operation Reinhard, for about a 16-month span. They killed more Jews than they ever had before. A couple of million Jews were killed in Operation Reinhard, mostly out in the camps of the East. Now, another loser was Adolf Eichmann. As a young man, he never graduated from schools. He washed out of some jobs as a salesman. He joined the Nazis in 1933, and he volunteered for the Sicherheitsdienst, the security service. And then he ended up going, as I mentioned, to Vienna, and his first job was taking charge of property from the Jews. He later on became a transportation specialist, and he later in the war, in the later stages of the war, he operated in Hungary and was in charge of deporting Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz. And he was, when he was caught finally, he escaped to Argentina and lived many years down there, was caught in the early 60s, and he was saying, I was just following orders, but his correspondence, as I had mentioned before, showed that he really reveled in what he was doing. He thought it was great.
But they never caught Mengele.
No, they didn't. Well, they knew where he was. They could have, but
He lived till 90-some-odd years of age.
That's right, unfortunately. Well, justice isn't always done. Mentioning of Hannah Arendt, in covering the trial of Adolf Eichmann, here's one of her famous quotes: "The essence of totalitarian government, and perhaps the nature of every bureaucracy, is to make functionaries and mere cogs in the administrative machinery out of men, and thus to dehumanize them." So it's saying that Adolf Eichmann was dehumanized. I'm not sure that's true. He knew what the hell he was doing. He was an evil human, but I don't think he was a machine. I agree with that criticism of Hannah Arendt. And then Rudolf Hess, not to be confused with the Rudolf Hess who stole a plane and he flew to England and tried to broker a separate peace. He was the deputy Führer, that's H-E-S-S. This guy, his name I believe is pronounced Hess, but he was actually like the kind of a robotic killer that Hannah Arendt describes. He was in a religious family. His upbringing was in a religious family, but he was also kind of a loner. He served in the First World War, and then he got himself into trouble. He was in a paramilitary unit of the kind that was roaming around Germany, shooting people up and causing mayhem. He was sent to jail for 5 years, and then he met Heinrich Himmler, who was a chicken farmer, at a group for aspiring farmers, mystic agriculturalists called the Atmanen. And Himmler took a liking to him and invited him into the SS. And he was loyal to Himmler all the way. They eventually made him the commandant of Auschwitz. And in his trial there, he was asked whether everyone who was killed there deserved it. And he said, "I never gave it much thought. I wanted to be notorious for being hard so I would not be considered soft." So that's this guy. And here he is. That's the Russians hanging him, so at least he got
That's Auschwitz.
his just,
That's
yeah.
a picture of Auschwitz.
Right. Yeah, the Russians were the ones who liberated Auschwitz. We didn't go in there. The Ruskies got there first. So, but that was 47. I mean, that was after the liberation, so he spent some time in jail for a while. Okay, and a few more of the big operators. Hermann Goering, we'd mentioned before. He started out as the Russian Minister of the Interior. He was a political rival of Himmler, lost out in a lot of ways. But the Gestapo, their primary job actually was to round up and detain communists as well as other enemies of the state. They didn't concentrate all that much on Jews. Ernst Röhm was the head of the SA. This is Röhm, the head of the SA. He was head of the brown shirts. He was a brutal sexual pervert, and Hitler found a use for him until he no longer had a use for him, and then had him killed in the Night of the Long Knives. Himmler, that's him in 1933, he was the one who proclaimed the first concentration camps, and he originally reported to Ernst Röhm. That was his boss originally, but he got bigger and bigger, the SS got bigger and bigger, and they were able to eclipse Röhm, and he won out. Theodor Eicke was he was the commander, the second commander of Dachau, and he is the guy who actually killed Ernst Röhm. He was put in charge of Dachau, and he was a crazy man, cruel as a disciplinarian, but he was the one who instilled in the SS the idea that you had to be a fanatical, cruel, mindless killer, and the SS spirit was largely his work. He also was the guy who designed the capo structure, which was the use of prisoners in the camp to rule over individual prison blocks, give them some extra goodies, and make them do a lot of the dirty work. That was his baby. That was his work. This is the guy who was responsible for it, Theodor Eicke. Okay. And then some summary remarks. I've touched on most of these already. The camps, we think, were the Holocaust. They're not the whole story, not by a long shot. Many more deaths by mass shootings and other means. And then, let's see. Actually, I've touched on all of the points here already. Where it was a conference, the Vance conference was just a staff meeting, and ratifying what they already wanted to do and putting the SS officially in charge. These were the ones that the killing camps of the final solution. Once the killing really started, these were the ones who were out east. And you can see they were operating relatively short periods of time, but they killed a lot of people during those short periods of time. Kelmno, there were 20 gas vans that they had. The method of killing there was to put people in these vans that they would just drive around until the carbon monoxide from the engine, which was pumped into the rear compartment, was enough to kill them. They'd drive out into the forest, dump them off, and come back for more. There were 20 killing camps, 20 vans in that camp. Okay. Gas chambers began being installed in Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka in 1942. And then the close of 1943, you can see these were not in operation by the end of 1943, and much more of the killing then was sent to Auschwitz. Those concentration camps, by the way, they were called the Globocnik Camps, because there was a guy named Otto Globocnik who was in charge of 3 of these camps. I believe it was these 3. They were the Globocnik camps. Auschwitz and Majdanek, or Auschwitz-Birkenau. Auschwitz, we'd mentioned it, it's in Upper Silesia. There were about 1.1 million who were killed there over the course of time. 870,000 were immediately selected, and I'm sure we've seen the movies or we've heard the stories about you would get off the train and there would be an SS guy saying left, right, left, right. 870,000 about were sent to the left, and 250,000 were put to work. Some of them did survive. And Majdanek used mostly Zyklon B. That is still there. Hitler was furious with his people for abandoning it to the Russians. He wanted it destroyed, but the Russians got there first, and the evidence with the well-constructed gas chambers was there for all the world to see. I'd mentioned the IG Farben factory already, where they made rubber, tires, and so forth, a little bit out of range of our bombers, unfortunately. And Majdanek was also the place where all the goods that were taken from people who were shipped to camps were taken for redistribution back to the Reich. And when people were deported, a lot of times they took what they could carry, valuable stuff, money sewn into coats and jewelry and that sort of thing. So a lot of people got very rich at Majdanek and elsewhere. And here's a photo from Auschwitz. This is the selection. These people have already been chosen for death. But this is, here's an SS guy saying left, right, left, right. That's what they went through. And this also is Auschwitz. This is a place called Canada, which was the section where all of the goods that were taken away from people, the worldly goods, were brought to this section. And they called it Canada. It was a building or a series of buildings, and you can see a lot of stuff there that some prisoners are going through, coats, hats, whatever. There was some good stuff to be had there. Most of it ended up in German hands, but that was if you were able to get that assignment, you had a good chance of surviving or getting at least a little bit better treatment if you worked in Canada.
I'd like to go there with a mine detector, metal detector.
So, okay. All right, let's see, what else do we have here? Okay, I think the next, we've gone through much of the next one, what happened in 42, Operation Reinhard and the mass deportations. The tide of battle actually turned in the east at Stalingrad and Kursk, the big defeats of the German army. Stalingrad in that horrible winter. Kursk was the biggest tank battle in history, and Russian tanks were better than German tanks, and they won out there. This was where the Jewish rally in Madison Square Garden took place, 1933. And remember also that at the large wave of killing through 42 and 43, Allied troops weren't even on the continent yet. I mean, D-Day wasn't until 1944. And you can argue that we should have bombed, once we got there to Italy particularly, we should have bombed rail yards and that sort of stuff. And there was actually some military victory in 1943, and then hence over to Italy, but the bulk of our forces didn't come until the middle of 1944. So that a lot could have been done before the war, undoubtedly. We talked a lot about FDR last time and how he he could have been a little bit more courageous and spent a little bit more of his political capital and been more upfront about supporting the Jews, and he chose not to. Where it wasn't done, where enough wasn't done, I think was before the war. During the war, remember, we get ashore in 1944. It takes a couple of months to break out and to really gather strength. And then came the Battle of the Bulge late in 1944. I mean, to really mount something militarily against the camps, particularly out in the east, would have been a stretch. It was proposed, and of course the generals wanted no distraction. They wanted to just prosecute the war to its conclusion. So whether we did enough, I guess that's something that we all have to decide for ourselves. But I think the effort was reasonably good anyway by the Allies. It wasn't the greatest, a lot to criticize it, but I think we did. The War Refugee Board, as I mentioned, was set up in 1944 after they finally get rid of one of the bad guys in the State Department, Breckinridge Long. The War Refugee Board, which actually helped a lot of the Hungarian Jews through private donations from the Jewish community primarily. Henry Morgenthau was one of the big movers of that. They were supportive of Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat, who we'll talk about next time, who did quite a bit to save Hungarian Jews. The future Pope John the 23rd was also in on it as the papal delegate to the Ottoman Empire. He was very helpful over there too. We mentioned Schindler and Wallenberg. We'll talk a lot more about them next time around. But then the camps began shutting down in 1944. And then I did mention that there was a campaign, the North African campaign in 1943. That was a very near thing. And my friend Mary's husband, who was over there at the time, he was a railway policeman, among other things. And he went to Cairo right around the time, right before the Battle of El Alamein. But it was, the troops were about 100 miles to the west of Cairo, and had El Alamein gone the other way, the Germans would have come through Cairo, would have taken a left and gone up to Palestine and killed all the Jews there. So, okay, but then as they started closing down camps, there were, the Nazis forced a lot of people into forced marches, sometimes out through the forest, sometimes they would march them to other camps, sometimes they would just kill them. There were a lot of different ways, once they evacuated a camp, how they handled their Jewish population. This is Kluga in Estonia. That is one of the farthest reaching, the farthest labor camps from Germany. It was sent, people were sent, a couple of thousand people from Vilna were sent there to build fortifications against the expected tide of the Russian military, which in fact did come. They were up there for a couple of years. And when the Russians began marching back and pressing on the German forces, before they evacuated, the Germans killed all the people and set them aflame in the forest. And that's where my friend Mary's husband died, and a couple of her uncles. There was a camp, I do want to mention the camp called Stutthof on the Baltic, because that is where Mary spent a little bit of time. Talk a little bit more about that next time too. It was the first concentration camp that was set up outside Germany. Originally was set up to incarcerate Polish people who were opposing Germany. It got bigger and bigger during the course of the war. They only had a small gas chamber there, and the commandant was ordered to build more and more capacity to kill Jews. But it was also sort of a way station for Jews who were shipped from camps in the east. If they weren't killed, they came back. Some of them came back through Stutthof. Stutthof was also the place where the commandant, or maybe the guy who was the second in command, decided to set up a side business of making soap out of the fat from the dead Jewish folks. They would burn the fat and melt it and make pure Jewish fat soap. Stutthof was the place
think
where
there
that
was
happened.
40 satellite camps for
Okay.
that camp.
It was which?
It had 40 satellite camps around Stuttgart.
Oh, yeah, sure. There were, well, every big camp had a bunch of satellites, yeah. So, okay, we're almost out of time. So I will, let's see. Yeah, the Russians attacked in January 45. The prisoners from Auschwitz were sent by foot and by train westward. There was a train from Buchenwald to Dachau. Had more than 2,000 people dead by the time it arrived. That was another terrible discovery. And then in 45, there were many more forced marches from the camps. A lot of the camps were liberated. Some of the bad guys committed suicide, and then the Nuremberg Trials began. It happened. It happened very quickly. There were a lot of trials. We have some interesting history of my friend Mary's family in and around the trials, which we'll get to next time. There were a lot of people who actually didn't get hanged as they richly deserved. Many of the big guys were executed, but a lot of middle and lower level people just got away with it. Later on, when Adenauer was rebuilding Germany, he brought back a lot of people who had been in the Nazis into government, or at least forgave them, with the idea that you can't segregate everybody who fought for our side, from the new Federal Republic of Germany. And so a lot of people, perhaps who deserved punishment, didn't get it. It had a positive effect in one sense, in that West Germany did become a united country, and they were a pretty good bulwark against communism, but that was a price I think we had to pay for it. The Jewish Secret Service caught Eichmann in 1960, and he was hanged in 1961. And that was a key event also in the history of the Holocaust, because up until that time, very few people talked publicly about what had happened. But the trial of Eichmann opened people's eyes to what had happened. More and more people felt confident about coming forward. The 10 years or 15 years of silence, many people probably thought that was enough. Folks began to speak out. Also, some of the testimony in the Eichmann trial brought forth and really got the work at Yad Vashem, the memorial, which is in Israel, which has the Avenue of the Righteous, and which honors the righteous among nations. It was already sort of established, but they didn't do much about it until the Eichmann trial, and the effort really got underway after that to look for righteous Gentiles, recognize them and honor them, and many thousands of them have been recognized since then, but the Eichmann trial was a watershed there. And I'll end it with another quote. I'll end today with another quote from Rabbi Stephen Wise, who was the president of the American Jewish Congress. He was a good guy and a friend of FDR, but he was also the Jewish leader who was non-confrontational. He didn't want to raise too much of a stink, at least publicly, because he might make things worse, or he would either over in Europe, or he might rile up people at home who really didn't like Jews. So his critics, and there were many of them, derided him for being deferential to Roosevelt and not leading the fight by the Jews. And the frontiers of civilization have been crossed, he said in 1933. He was right, but he, like FDR, didn't speak up possibly as much as he could have. So this, I don't know, I don't know what I would do if I were in his situation. Maybe I wouldn't have the courage to speak up as well. I don't know, but it seems that we should speak unpleasant truths if they're really needed, and don't mince words, because evil people are going to do what they're going to do. And playing nice with them doesn't help, at least in my opinion. So with that, we can close. It is 2 o'clock. Next time, I have some slides about, we'll start with Vilna, and then we'll get into the story of my friend Mary Wygotsky, who was a native of Vilna. She survived 3 concentration camps at Kaiserwald, Stutthof, and Magdeburg. Her husband got out of Europe early. He lucked out in 1938. He went to Israel to study and stayed there. They met there, and they had a great life. And she, after many years, decided that she really needed to speak out. But her story is remarkable. Her family did some remarkable things, and we'll get into all of that next time. So thank you very much. It's a wrap.
Thank you.